Your Hungry Brother, Part 2, written and narrated by Marian Dorflinger. Chapter 6, Getting the Hell Out of Hell. Something amazing happened to Cassie and me as we entered the absolute darkness of hell. It seemed like those barely visible glows of light we were carrying around inside of us just blasted into mega bright floodlights, and we could see into every dim corner of hell. And every dim corner of hell was filled with unhappy, bitterly angry people who glared at us and shielded their eyes because our light was hurting them. Hell, or at least the part of hell I was in, really is a lot like, I remember C.S. Lewis describing it in The Great Divorce. Just a myriad of confusing streets. Now, you can believe this, or you can tell me that I'm a liar, but this selfish person I'd been when I closed the door on Jesus naked and hungry 20 years before my death was all of a sudden filled with compassion for the suffering souls around me in hell. "I'm sorry," I called out to them. "I'm sorry we're hurting you with our light, but we're looking for Cassie's hungry brother." "Cassie?" said an old man with a long white beard. "So you're Cassie?" "Yes, I am," said Cassie. "Yes, I've heard of you," said the old man. "Quite the crack whore, weren't you?" "Yeah, I guess my hungry brother couldn't help spreading the gossip about me, huh?" And what she said, and when she said it, made her inner light dim by half. But I was the only one who noticed, because it was still so bright to the souls in hell. "Everything he told me was in strictest confidence," said the old man. "I'm his psychiatrist." "He doesn't need a shrink," said Cassie. "He needs true love, and I've come to bring it to him. He's waiting for you in the last house at the end of this street," said the old man. "Tell him Sigmund Freud recommends he give you another chance." "You're Sigmund Freud?" I said, falling again into my fascination with celebrities. "You needn't look so surprised," said Siggy. "This is the part of hell where suicides who are waiting for someone come, and I did commit suicide. I'm waiting for my wife to opine that it's time to come and get me, but I don't think she's coming, so I do the good that I can down here." Cassie and I walked on, and the further we were down that street, the shabbier and more run down the houses became. It struck me as funny that there should be a ghetto in hell. At last we came to the last house in hell, and outside the house on a bench sat a young man with fiery black eyes and a man of about 55 years old with two missing teeth in the front. They were deep in conversation and didn't even see us until Cassie yelled out, "Chester, oh Chester!" and she ran to the young man with the black eyes. He stood up, and she literally leapt into his arms and wrapped her arms and legs around him. You should have seen the tears of that reunion. Ah, beautiful. And after all the crying and explaining and forgiving was done, Cassie said, "Let's go, Chester." And Chester looked down at the older man with the two missing teeth and said, "Will you walk out of hell with us, Jesse?" And the man, Jesse, shook his head and said, "No, I won't go. I won't release you from your promise either. I told my hungry brother that I wouldn't leave hell until he came to get me, and I'm keeping my word." The color drained out of Chester's face, and his hands started shaking, and he sat back down on the bench beside Jesse. "What's going on here?" said Cassie. "I made a promise," said Chester. "He made a promise," put in old Jesse. "Tell me about this promise," said Cassie. Chester shrugged and said, "I promised Jesse here that I wouldn't leave him in hell alone. He's been alone a long time, and I don't think his hungry brother is ever coming." It was an easy promise to make, Cassie, because I'd been waiting and waiting for you, and I'd given up. But here you are, just a little too late. Cassie hung her head and started crying, and I amazed myself by grabbing her shoulder and shaking her and saying, "Hey, snap out of it. I'll fix everything." Who was this person I had become who boldly fixed unsolvable problems? What had happened to me since I died and met Jesus face to face? "How can you fix this?" Cassie said. "I'll stay with Jesse," I replied. Chester, Jesse, and Cassie all looked at me in amaze, but I just set my jaw and said, "Get up, Chester. You're sitting in my spot." Chester got up, but Jesse grabbed onto me and said, But Cassie grabbed onto me and said, "No, babe, this ain't right. There has to be another way." I hugged her and told her a little lie that she had realized was a lie later on, but which she would believe long enough to get out of hell. I said, "It's nothing to worry about. My hungry brother will find a way to get me out of here one day." Oh, Jesse went, good luck with that one." "Just go, Cassie," I said. She kissed me, and Chester gripped my hand. I saw that Cassie's inner light was glowing with greater intensity than ever now, and that Jesse had taken on a glow similar to what all the people of purgatory enjoy. And after they had gone, I saw to my surprise that my glow had not faded. I thought sure that all my inner light would have been extinguished with my decision to stay in hell. The fact that I still had inner light was a great comfort to me in hell. But Jesse didn't like it at all. "Ain't there anything you can do to shut that damned light off?" he said. I laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed since I'd bought the farm. "Nope," I said, "but if the light bothered you here in hell, I'll be glad to walk with you to a place where it'll feel good to see light." "You can go to hell," Jesse said, and he squeezed his eyes shut as tight as he could. "But it gets old sitting with your eyes shut tight." After a while, he opened them and looked me in the face. "Why'd you do it?" he asked. "You mean stay here with you so Chester could leave?" I asked. "I mean exactly that," Jesse said. I shrugged. "I could say it was because everyone loves a young couple who are in love with each other," I said. "I could talk about Romeo and Juliet," I said. "But all that would be a lie, and there's no need to lie in hell. Once you figure out you're stuck there, and no one you talk to is going to leave anyway, so I'll tell the truth. I did it just because it was the right thing to do. Just because it was the right thing to do. I did it." Jesse coughed and choked and sputtered. He looked at me with eyes that looked wide enough to pop. "Nobody does the right thing just because it's the right thing to do," he said. "Well, I did, and I do it every time the same way." "You mean to tell me," he said, "that it's possible to just sit down and figure out what's right and what's wrong, regardless of rewards and punishments, and then you'll just do the right thing because it's the right thing to do?" "You can when you grow up," I said. "You can when you grow up." He jumped to his feet, and he seemed to grow 100 years younger, and a light greater than my own burst out from the inside him, and he shouted, "If that's the truth, then let's get the hell out of hell." Chapter 7, Reappraisal. "You've got to be kidding," said Jesus Christ. For the second time in 2 days, I was standing before the Christ, and I was amazed to find him amazed at me. "You're faking it, right?" I said. "You knew all along I'd go with Cassie to hell and decide to stay there so Chester could leave." "I knew no such thing," said Jesus Christ. Now I was the one who was amazed. "But you know everything," I said. "You know what's going to happen before it happens." "Where is that written?" said Jesus. "I don't know anything before it happens." "Well, I'll be..." "Don't finish that sentence." I gulped and said, "Okay." "Now," said Jesus, "let's get this straight one more time. After sitting down in hell and waiting for his stubborn, hungry brother to come and get him for 100 years, Jesse decided on the spur of the moment to come on up here to heaven because I told him that I'd done the right thing just because it's the right thing. And not because you wanted a reward or feared a punishment? That's right, Lord. Jesus wept. And then he gave me a massive hug and said, "Come on in." I hugged him back, and then I broke off the embrace and stepped away. "I can't," I said. "What?" said Jesus. "You can't? We're talking heaven here, the thing all you mortals long for." "Yeah, I want to, but I can't." He leaned a hand against the globe of light and gave me a slantwise glance and said, "This is going to be good. Explain yourself, please." "Okay," I said. "I can't because Rich Young Ruler and Preacher Man and Buff Bill are sitting in that little cabin wondering what's become of their girl Cassie. I'll send word that she and Chester made it straight to heaven." "That's not good enough," I said. "You do know you're talking to the real live Messiah of the universe here, don't you?" But he said it with a grin. "It's like this, Jesus. Buff Bill and the other two had a part in giving Cassie encouragement and love and good advice and all the other kind things people give one another in times of trouble, as opposed to tearing each other apart. There's much a part of the good that came into Cassie's life as I am, maybe more. I'm not going in without them." He looked thoughtful for a long time before he spoke again. Then he said, "How would you like to take a little trip?" And I said, "I'll go anywhere you say, as long as I end up back in that cabin with Buff and Preacher and Rich Young." He laid a hand upon my shoulder. I blinked once, and then he and I were sitting side by side on the moon, looking at the planet Earth. "I knew you were going to ask me if it was cold on the moon. Well, maybe it would have been if I were made of the same stuff you are. But to me, it just felt pleasant and cool. But the coolness on my skin, my spirit skin, is a dimly remembered sensation compared to the inner peace. I didn't need heaven. I just needed to be with Jesus." Jesus sighed, looked towards the earth, and said, "It's pretty from up here, isn't it? Planet Earth." "Yes," I said, "all of it. Not just parts that you realize when you get closer." "Do you know how many planets there are?" Jesus asked. "I'm told it's an infinite number." "Well, that's not true. There is a finite number. But the number is so big it would take the average person a lifetime just to write the number down. And of all those planets, that big blue marble out there, that planet Earth, that's my favorite." "Why?" I said. "Because that is a planet where people go answer the only question that matters. Will I do the right thing because it's the right thing?" Do you know how few people actually say yes to that question? "I get the feeling not many," I said. "A kindergartner could write the number down and forget he had done so by the time recess is over." "My goodness," I said. "Yes, your goodness and my goodness, too. And here I am sitting beside someone who said yes to that question in hell of all places. And now I'm supposed to let you go back to that little cabin in purgatory when I'm dying to have you in heaven with me. You don't know what you're asking." "Maybe not," I said. "But I do know that you're big enough to let me do what I have to do." A tear rolled down the face of Jesus. On instinct, I caught it on my forefinger. And in that moment, we became equals, siblings, me and my big brother, Jesus. "Ah, dear one," he said, "why is it you had to die before you could become such a magnificent person?" "Because I never knew about my hungry brother." He nodded and smiled a sad smile. He took my hand and said, "Okay, be tough. Take the high road. Go back to that little cabin. But just remember, you're not alone. I'm watching over you." Chapter 8. Explaining Things. Instantaneously, I was sitting in my chair at the cabin. Buff Bill, Preacher Man, and Rich Young Ruler were staring at me with mouths agape. Buff Bill was the first to speak. "Where's our Cassie girl?" "In heaven," I said. And Buff Bill surprised me by lowering his face into his hand and wailing as if his heart were breaking. "In hell," and sobbing and saying, "I was afraid that would happen. I was afraid that would happen." I just sat there looking and feeling shocked and unable to respond. What could be in that man's mind, I was wondering, that would make him so happy another person had just gotten into heaven. But Rich Young and Preacher Man knew what to do. They rushed to his sides and put their hands on his back and spoke in soothing tones. "Hey there, old fella," said Preacher Man. "It ain't going to be long before we're all up there with our Cassie." And Rich Young said, "I have been through this many times, my friend. We must rejoice with our Cassie. We simply must." But Buff Bill didn't take comfort from their kind words. Instead, he stood up with tears streaming from his eyes and made fist of his hands and brought both fists down on the table so hard it was upended, and half-eaten buffalo steaks flew everywhere. "I'm never going to get out of here," he screamed. "God has taken away the few people he sent to help with my burden, and I can't get 1,000 boxcars of buffalo meat et all by myself. I can't do it in a million years. What am I going to do?" "Wait a minute," I said. "Are you telling me that's what you have to do to get into heaven? Eat all that meat by yourself?" "That, or feed it to guests," said Buff Bill. "Originally, every Indian that lived between Columbus discovering America and Custer's last stand had been invited to come to the feast, and I'd have gotten to heaven in one day. But the way God laid down the law to me was that they all had to come, which would have meant that they all had to forgive me for being one of the ones to kill off the buffalo and letting the Indians starve when the West was being won. But there were 3 who wouldn't come. 3. And because of those 3, I've been chewing and swallowing buffalo meat for a century and a half by myself. And then just a few years ago, Rich Young comes along, and then Preacher Man and Cassie and you, and now I see God is going to let all those people go to heaven, and I'll be alone again. I can't stand it." For the second time in 2 days, I stood up and said no. They all looked at me, and I pointed towards the cabin door. "Don't you all recognize the fact that you can look in almost any direction outside the door and see little lights moving around in the dark? Those are people looking for answers, looking for companionship, looking for a good old buffalo steak." Rich Young Ruler looked at me and clutched his hands to his breast and said, "Oh, the joy!" Preacher Man took off his hat and bowed his head. Buff Bill looked astonished and said, "You mean I could invite folks to come to the feast? I don't have to wait for them to come to me?" "Did God say otherwise?" I asked. "Nope," said Buffalo Bill. "On the day I stood before the Lord, he just said, someone has to eat the millions of buffaloes who were shot dead and left to rot while the people they were intended for starved to death. If the Indians had all agreed to come, their feast would have lasted only one day. But 3 would not come, so none of them will. So now you have to eat the steaks all by yourself or find someone else to share it with. On the day the last steak is gone, you will be welcomed into heaven." Oh. "Well then, let's start inviting some hungry folks to this feast," I said, and without waiting to see what the others would do, I grabbed up a skillet and a big metal spoon, and I went out on the door into the darkness and started hammering on that skillet with a spoon and whistling as loud as I could. I haven't told you what I used to do on Earth to make my living because, up to now, it had no bearing on my story. But now I will reveal to you that I was a professional singer, and I had a great pair of lungs, and, for some strange reason, I had the ability to whistle like no one else could. I had a whistle that would carry long and far on Broadway in rush hour. Just imagine, then, how far it carried in silent purgatory. I was filled with joy as I banged that skillet and whistled with all my might. The reason for my joy was that of a sudden realization was sprung up inside me. I realized that I was in a place where you can wallow in the misery you carried with you from the earth for a whole century or for 2,000 years, and then in a second, you can take the action that turns all the misery into joy. That realization had just enough time to form fully in my mind before Buff Bill and Rich Young and Preacher Man were beside me, banging on skillets and letting their voices blend with mine, and the sweetest cacophony that you ever heard echoed and echoed back and forth through the canyons and the mountains of purgatory. And our labor was not in vain. In every direction, except from the direction of that totally dark place where you could enter hell, we saw those wandering little spots of light stop in their tracks. I could feel hundreds of lost souls turning and looking. I could feel them seeing our gathered light. And then they all started moving in our direction. You would not believe the shout of joy that burst from Buff Bill's lips, and that old cowboy started dancing a jig. But he couldn't dance for long, because a freight train arrived. I hadn't noticed before, but there had been a single boxcar filled with buffalo steaks parked nearby our little rustic cabin. How many years had Bill been eating away? How many years had Bill been eating away on that single boxcar? And now a train with all that remained of the original 1,000 boxcars of Buffalo Bill and his peanuts was parked at our door. But there was more on that train than food. A dozen souls had just started walking in our direction at the first banging on the skillet, and they'd hitched a ride. Buff Bill grabbed each of them in turn, and they jumped to the ground and swung them around and said, "Welcome to the feast, welcome, pard." Furthermore, the switchman, porter, conductor, who'd greeted me early on, was there with his gold chain across his vest and his kindly face, and he was making sure that the tracks, which seemed to sprout from the bare earth, didn't come too close to the cabin. The clerk, the Fonzie type who liked to say A, with the laptop, was in Bill's face, telling him that he had 998 boxcars remaining and over 10,000 people asking for a place at the table. An army of angels, or whatever, designated as caterers, were setting up rows and rows of picnic tables and firing up unbelievable, complicated, and unbelievable efficient outdoor kitchens. You know how on Earth crowds sometimes have to be controlled? They have this magnificent crowd control in heaven and purgatory and maybe in hell as well, with no connection, with no conscious effort on the seas of onrushing lights that represented souls wandering through purgatory, lined up in orderly lines, and soon the picnic tables and angel caterers had set up were being filled with feasters. No sooner did these feasters sit down than a plate of succulent food was set before them, and they were told to say grace and set to. With tears streaming down his face, Buff Bill saw boxcar after boxcar simply vanish into thin air as they were emptied of steaks. "How can this be?" he said to me. How can it be that after 150 years alone, or with almost no one to help me, the whole world's on my side?" I hugged him and said, "Don't ask. Just say your goodbyes real quick, because you're not going to be here long." It was true. Those steaks were going faster than fast. And that was not the only change in the order of things. As I have explained, the only light one has in purgatory is the light one carries within and alone. It is so little that you can barely see it, take it around without falling. But when you start putting people and ergo lights together, then splendid things began to happen. Now suddenly, the area around the rustic little cabin was lit by thousands of inner lights, plus a little help from the artificial lights of the train, and what was revealed to us was a magnificent thing to see. In my mind, purgatory had been bleak and desert-like because that was how I felt carrying all my guilt around. But now my guilt was assuaged, and there was light to see that we were in reality dwelling in nature's paradise of tall pines and blue lakes and soaring eagles. And our rustic little cabin was not the only one. As far as I could see, there were cabins and tall white farmhouses with many rooms, and believe it or not, teepees surrounding our rustic little cabin. They had all been previously unoccupied, but now, in the most orderly fashion, as soon as each feasting guest's appetite was sated, he or she walked up and embraced Bill, and then went to find the kind of lodging he or she preferred. "This is amazing," said Buffalo Bill. And Preacher Man said, "Buff, would you take a look off in that direction?" I looked towards the direction Preacher Man was indicating, and I would have shouted for joy, but I had been shouting for joy so long now that this wondrous thing I saw seemed to be calling for the opposite reaction: silence. Bill was silent too, and so were the thousands upon millions of Indians who followed on the heels of the man I recognized from the history books, Buffalo Bill's best friend, Sitting Bull. There were no words spoken between the man who'd slaughtered the buffalo and the ones who had starved because he had done so. No one asked why the last 3 Indians had finally given in and agreed to forgive Bill. We just all knew that they had. Bill walked up and embraced Sitting Bull in the most absolute of silences. And then there was Jesus Christ in that unbelievably big globe of light, and Bill and every Indian who died between Columbus and Custer walked into heaven without looking our way. And I felt complete. Chapter 9, Circle of 3. I felt complete every minute I spent in purgatory after the day of the buffalo feast, as we called it. Preacher Man and Rich Young Ruler and I were part of a city of souls in purgatory now, as opposed to being 3 refugees in the wilderness, but we had been bonded by things that the newcomers could not understand, just as each and every one of them had things going on in their lives that were none of our business. For this reason, even though we now had things to do besides sit in our cabin and talk, things like swimming in the pristine blue lakes and go to parties, we still chose to confine all our serious conversations to those times when only the 3 of us were together. Preacher Man gave me a nickname, and it stuck. He called me Problem Solver, because in 2 days I'd providentially seen what it would take to get Cassie and Bill into heaven. I would sometimes go alone and pray and ask Jesus to let me be the problem solver for Rich Young and Preacher Man, to the extent that they might need me to be, and a warm glow in the region of my heart said that that would be fine. But along with that assurance came a warning, and it went like this: be the problem solver for those 2, for they are your family here, and solving their problems makes you an imitator of the Christ. But mind your business when it comes to everyone else, because trying to solve everyone's problem makes you an usurper of the Christ, and hell lies in that direction. So I concentrated on being the problem solver for Rich Young and Preacher Man, and I just partied with everyone else. Preacher Man still had the only Bible around, which made him a much sought-after individual. A great many people would knock on our door and ask him to read them this passage or that passage that they wished they had taken more seriously on earth. His reading would be followed by long discussions. Then these people would leave, and soon thereafter we would learn that they had been given entry into heaven or sent to another world to get something right they'd failed at previously. Thinking gets easy up in purgatory because there are no distractions from the truth, and you ask questions you might have never formulated on earth. Also, vague ideas on earth become concrete thoughts in purgatory. One day I asked Preacher Man, why is it people sometimes get sent to other worlds from purgatory, and why is there even a purgatory when the Bible teaches that it's either heaven or hell? You mean the Protestant Bible, right? Said Preacher Man. Right, I said. I don't know, he said, but if you had suggested such a thing to me during my time on earth, I would have said you just damned yourself, and so would have the Apostle Paul. Well then, that's right. What's right? When you say, well then, and let the sentence hang in midair, and hope somebody else will finish it for you, you're telling yourself the truth. But it's so difficult to accept, you hope somebody will step in and tell you a lie. The truth is that we don't know why the Bible doesn't have all the answers, after all, and we won't know until we look God in the eye. The truth is that, well then, is the end of the conversation. And when somebody steps in and tries to help you, then you and they are complicit, and that, the $4 word, is a lie. That'll never happen in purgatory, because it happens all the time on earth. Just trust me, problem solver. I knew a couple of Buddhists down the trail from here. I had a talk with them, and they told me I was all wet in every aspect, and then they kissed my feet and turned around and walked straight into heaven without a backwards glance, and Jesus just looked at me and shook his head all sad like, Christians aren't the only ones getting in, and not all of us are getting in, and you can take my word for it or call me a liar. Try not to think about it too much. But if you have to think about it at all, then try to think about it all the time, or you'll lose your sanity, and that's all I got to say about that. I sat back speechless. Preachers on earth, the ones that make a living, don't generously contradict the Bible, although they make the Bible contradict itself. And here was Preacher Man, the most conservative of conservatives while on earth, admitting freely that he'd stood and watched two Buddhists walk into heaven with Jesus blessing them. I really couldn't handle it, so I put it out of my mind and forced myself to focus on solving Preacher Man's problem. I never questioned reincarnation again. Preacher Man, I said, how long have you been dead? Since before you were born, he said. So where's your hungry brother? He looked ashamed. Go on, tell me. I don't know, he said. What? Didn't Jesus tell you when he'd be coming for you and where to find him? It's not like that for me, said Preacher Man. Me finding him is part of my penance, and I don't know how to do that. Tell me everything, I said. Preacher Man had had his Bible sitting open in his lap. Now I closed it and set it on the table between us. It's like this, problem solver. A long time ago, when my pony tried to jump an icy creek and didn't make it, and we crashed through the ice and died, and I stood in front of Jesus, Jesus told me that all I had to do to get into heaven was to retrace my steps through life, and that if I paid attention, I'd discover where I'd had the opportunity to feed my hungry brother and who he was. When I did that, Jesus said, I could apologize to his family. That's all I had to do, find the right person and say I'm sorry. But I couldn't find my hungry brother. I was stunned by what he did not say. Do you mean, I said, that you have the power to go to Earth and look for your hungry brother? Yes. You can go to Earth? Yes, but it does me no good. I did everything I could to find him. but it was hopeless. How did you do it? Do what? Go to Earth? I nodded. I just think about it and I'm there. Can you take me with you? I can take anybody with me I want, as long as they abide by the rule. And the rule is, I asked? That they have to agree that they are only going along to help me find my hungry brother. They ain't along to try to break from the business I gotta do and go look up old friends or warn people about what's ahead. That was hard to take. But I got over it and came back and said, take me down there with you. Why? There ain't nothing to do no more. My hungry brother's bones is rotted away by now, and the family I was supposed to say I'm sorry for has growed up and had kids and passed on. I couldn't find the right person 100 and some years ago. How can I find him now? Because now they have the internet. What? The internet? What's that? Didn't Cassie talk about it? No. Or preacher man, I could tell you about the internet, or I can show you. But trust me, it's a way to access information, trace genealogies in minutes that would have taken an expert years to put together 100 years ago. We can find out who your hungry brother was, and we can find his descendants, I'm certain. You giving me some hope, problem solver? Let's not hold hands and let's just hold hands and think about Earth, I said, feeling great. Not without me, if you please, said Rich Young Ruler. He had been listening quietly for such a long time that hearing his voice was actually startling. When I looked at him, I saw misery in his face. It is like this, problem solver, he said. For 2,000 years, I have been living with people who speak English. I know dialects of English that would sound like a foreign language to you. Those dialects have gone extinct, and I have had to learn new ones. The Lord, who told me all I had to do to be saved 2,000 years ago was to give up my possessions to the poor and come follow him, told me upon my death that one day one who speaks English would help me find my hungry sister. I cannot explain to you how many hundreds of English speakers I have told my problem to, and none of them could tell me how to find a lady who lived in Jerusalem and died of hunger in the year 33 A.D. But now I hear you saying that there is this thing called the internet that can trace history back to Preacher Man's hungry brother. Please tell me you can find my hungry sister. I reached out and took his hand, and Preacher Man took mine and Rich Young's, so that we formed a circle of three. If I can't find your hungry sister today, I said, I'll stick by you until I can. I promise, even if it takes another 2,000 years. And then a miracle happened, and we blinked out of purgatory and came to earth. Chapter 10, Georgia. Ain't nothing much changed in 100 years, except now they have them horseless carriages instead of horses and buggies, and the church is old and fallen in instead of nice and neat and new. It sure was a waste of time for me to get all obsessed about building that church as opposed to making sure hungry folk got fed. That was a summation with which Preacher Man summed up his thoughts on being back in the part of Georgia where he had been a circuit rider in the foggy long ago. The foggy long ago. The foggy long ago. The three of us were standing upon a little hillock looking down into the valley where a tiny town was nestled, surrounded on every side by mountains. It was a poor town and a dying town, with more people in the cemetery than above ground. Many of the buildings were empty. But there was a library, and there is a library in America. Even in the towns that are dying, there's usually internet access. Let's go, I said, and we went down the hill. Rich Young Ruler was looking around, amazed. A car to him was a fearful thing. When one passed us and then pulled over onto the shoulder of the road, he almost bolted. I had to grab him to keep him from jumping over the fence beside the road. From out of the parked car issued a fat man clad in a very faded police uniform. His face was merry and his head was bald. "Y'all need a lift?" he said. "I'm what passes for the law up here in this part of Georgia, and we don't get too many out-of-town folk, so it'd be a real treat for me to show y'all around. Y'all can call me Clancy the Cop." Rich young Ruder looked like a child about to go on his first roller coaster ride, and he got into the police car with fear and joy written all over his face. I was just glad not to have to walk so far, because it felt strange having a body of flesh and blood again. It felt exhausting. And Preacher, he just regarded Clancy the Cop with a look that I could not decipher. But Clancy said, "You're thinking you might know me, ain't you?" he said. "I think I knew you a long time ago," said Preacher Man. "Would that have been in South Kentucky?" said Clancy. "That's where I used to live." "Maybe so," said Preacher Man. "Maybe so." I set him back with Rich Young, and Preacher Man sat up front with Clancy, and in a minute or two we were at the library. When we got out, Clancy said, "Y'all have a good time," and drove off. Preacher Man stared after him and said, "That man's family used to live in the south of Kentucky. I wonder if I used to preach to them. My circuit took in that part of the country for a while. But this is the part where I decided to build a new church. It just had to be built, in my mind. And now there's that church over there falling down. I was so proud the day that church was finished, being built, and it was my pride to let my hungry brother starve. I gotta find his family." I grabbed him by the shoulders and gave him a gentle shake. "Snap out of it, old boy," I scolded. "We're at the library to track your hungry brother down, and shedding tears here outside the library isn't doing anybody any good." So we went in the library. The librarian was a sweet little old lady. Librarians are among my favorite people. She introduced herself as Gertie Pascott, and she asked Rich Young where he was from. "Jerusalem, my good woman," said Rich Young, and she blushed and said, "Then I certainly hope you enjoy your time in America, and I certainly hope the folks over there can stop killing each other." And Rich Young said, "I have been wishing that very thing for more years than you can imagine." I reached into my hip pocket and said a prayer of thanks to find my wallet, complete with picture ID, right there. In a few seconds I had a library card, and I was sitting down in front of one of the library's computers. Preacher Man and Rich Young were equally amazed by the computer. I thought back to my younger days when not everyone had a computer, and I appreciated how miraculous it seemed to me to surf the net for the first time. How much more exciting then to step out of a past century into the era of a world wide web. In the search engine, I punched in "History of the Circuit Riders." No matter what the subject, someone has written a history about it and posted it on the web, and such was the case of the old circuit riders. And there, in alphabetical order, were the names of every circuit rider who ever lived. "What was your last name?" I asked. "Magruder," said Preacher Man. "And there's my name, Silas Magruder. Can we see what it says about me?" I clicked on Silas Magruder link, and Preacher Man gaped to see a picture of himself pop up on the screen. And then his heart was broken when he read the history that had been recorded about him. There were a lot of facts and statistics concerning how many conversions he had made. There were 3 paragraphs dedicated to the erection of the first church with stained glass windows in that part of Georgia, but the rest of the history was devoted to the story of the Scokesbury Blizzard. As soon as he saw the words Scokesbury Blizzard, he put his head down and cried. "Now I know where my hungry brother was," he moaned, "and down deep I've always known. I just couldn't say it to myself until right now. Here's the story, and you hear it, please do your best not to hate Preacher Man. I found that someone had done something so awful that you can't even say it to themselves, and then they finally do say it to themselves. It's time for passing out medals instead of blame. In the middle of the 1800s, Preacher Man was riding his circuit through Georgia on up into southern Kentucky, and he became fixated on erecting the first church with stained glass in Georgia. This obsession became so great that he pressured his flocks, that's what they called congregations once upon a time, into donating massive amounts of money towards the building project. And once the right amount of money had been donated, he quit his circuit and spent all his time in that one little town in Georgia, where we were now, sitting in the library. He asked me not to tell you the name of the town, because somebody there might have had a great-great-grandmother who was as proud of that church as he was, and he doesn't want that person to feel bad. Hope you understand. Overreact. How proud Preacher Man was to be overseeing the building of this church when he was alive and foolish. Bad things began to happen in all the other towns on the Preacher Man circuit, and people sent urgent messages asking him to come, but, as he explained to me, I just didn't understand. Nothing these folks were telling me seemed all that serious. And 1 week before the new church with the stained glass windows was completed, a freak blizzard hit in Skokesbury, Kentucky. It was the strangest weather event of the century. Tons of snow and ice were dumped in a 1 mile square region, and there was no snow anywhere else. Unfortunately, the town right at the heart of that 1 square mile was Skokesbury. Communication being inferior then to now, meaning nobody in Skokesbury had a phone, the only way the people in Skokesbury could get help was to send people out on horseback to the surrounding communities for help. And the man who was sent to this part of Georgia was named Milo Clancy. Clancy the cop is the man I'm looking for, said Preacher Man, when we got to that part in the text. Yeah, I'm sure you're right, I said, but let's read the rest of the story. He hung his head and nodded. When Milo Clancy got to this part of Georgia, he found weather that was clear and crisp with no snow on the ground and dozens of people working like worker bees on the new church building. Y'all need to stop what you're doing and come with me to Skokesbury and help my people get shoveled out and clear the roads and bring in wood and such, 'cause we got 7 foot of snow and we don't know what to do. And all the people working on the church dropped everything to go to the aid of Skokesbury. But then Silas, the Preacher Man, stood upon the roof of the nearly completed church, with his arms flung wide as if he were being crucified, with a Bible, the very Bible he carried in purgatory, in his right hand, and he shouted out, I pronounce God's judgment on everybody that don't stay until this church is built. There ain't nothing going on in Skokesbury that's more important than God's work. And the people of Georgia went back to work on the church. And the people of Skokesbury, Kentucky, well, Clancy headed back alone. And, being so upset, he whipped his horse savagely, and the horse bucked him off and stomped on him and broke both of Clancy's legs, and Clancy starved to death before anybody found him. When he read that part, Preacher Man started weeping and got up and fled the building. As luck would have it, Clancy the cop was on his way back right when Preacher Man got out of the door of the library. Preacher Man ran up to the patrol car, and Clancy stood on the brakes and got out. Preacher Man ran to him and got down on his knees and said, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And his body died on the spot, but I saw his spirit go to heaven. Chapter 11, Jerusalem. Rich young ruler and I stood and watched the ascension of Preacher Man, a.k.a. the Reverend Silas McGruder. We watched Clancy the cop doing CPR on a body that was never going to breathe again. After our friend's soul was out of sight, Rich Young took my hand and said, It's my turn now. Let us be off before your constable orders us to give report. How do we be off, I said. We're on foot in a small town. Let me try to do what Preacher Man did to bring us here, said Rich Young. You mean travel to a place just by thinking about it? Precisely, said Rich Young. And where do we travel to? I said, Jerusalem. and we were there. We were sitting side by side at the top of a mountain, and I knew as surely as if Jesus Christ had said it to me himself, that we were sitting in the exact spot where Jesus had stood when he delivered the famous Sermon on the Mount. And in my lap was Preacher Man's Bible. I picked it up and fell open to, you guessed it, the Sermon on the Mount, starting with Matthew chapter 5. If you've got a Bible, go read it. As always happens in a story like this, my attention was directed to one particular verse, and that verse was Matthew 5:6. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. I read that verse right out loud, and all hell broke loose inside of Rich Young. Now I know, he said, after all these years, I know who my hungry sister was and how she starved to death. He wept, he screamed, he pulled his hair out, and he pounded his chest. But can you blame him? That repentance had been 2,000 years in the coming. Why should he not be emotional? After he had screamed himself out and leaned heavily against him, I held him like a child. Talk about it, I said. He produced a clean hanky. How he can do that in the afterlife, I still don't know, and blew his nose. Then he said, have you read my story in the Bible? Sure, I said. He went to Jesus and said, Lord, what must I do to be saved? And Jesus said to keep the commandments, and you said you had done so since your youth. And Jesus said one more thing, like he was a Columbo. Who is this Columbo? Said Rich Young. Never mind, I said. But the point is, Jesus said, one thing you lack, one more thing. Sell all your possessions and give your money to the poor, so that you will have treasures in heaven, and then come, follow me. And you went away sad because you had great wealth. And Jesus watched you go sadly and said, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. Yes, said Rich Young, that is a story people have been telling about me for 2,000 years. And it's all true. It happened just that way. But there's more to it, I asked. Yes, said Rich Young, there's more to it. That is the part about my sister. Your hungry sister? She was not hungry at that time. I'm listening to you, I said. He sighed. The story tells that I was a rich young ruler, but I also had a name, and my name was Benjamin. And the people I was ruler over were the merchants who bought and sold purple linen. Making cloth purple was difficult and expensive back in those days. Problem solver. And the people who did it well got very rich. My father had risen from simple fisherman to the head of the society who made and traded in purple cloth. He passed all this wealth and authority on to me when I was 18. 18, problem solver, was so young to receive such a burden, and on top of all that was another burden, my lame sister. My sister, Sarah, was a simple girl. Her mind did not work as it should, and in those days, the lame and the simple starved if no one with money cared for them. There was no department of welfare or temporary assistance for needy families, only the willy-nilly support of people with hearts that could be so hard, and I was the only person my sister had. Ah, Sarah, I gave up heaven for you. You mean the reason you couldn't sell all your possessions was because there was no money for your sister? There would have been no money? I mean precisely that. Did Jesus know? He must have. Then why would he ask this thing of you? Because of the verse that you just read. I should have been hungry to be righteous, life being so short anyway, and so should have Sarah. And now, sitting here on this mountain and remembering it all, I realized too late that Sarah truly was hungry for righteousness, that she could have been. She could have not been hungry for bread and fish, as hungry as she was for righteousness. I should have done this thing Jesus have asked me, for her and for myself. Tell me about that day, I said. The day I asked Jesus for salvation, said Rich Young. Yes. On that morning, Sarah came to me and shook me awake. "Brother Benjamin," she said, "a great teacher is telling us how to see the prophecies fulfilled. Go and ask him if he is a Messiah." I always wanted little Sarah to be happy, so I did as she asked. I thought, however, that I was only going on a lark. Jerusalem was full of people posing themselves as a Messiah in those days, and years before and years after. Had I a bit of time to prepare myself for how serious this thing was, I would have made a better choice. But I approached this ragtag prophet at a time when I was dressed head to toe in royal purple, and I was young and what you American people call cocky. I did not realize I was talking to the Messiah until after I had said the words, "Lord, what must I do to be saved?" After I said those words, problem solver, he looked me in the eye and told me to make myself poor. And I knew in that moment that I was talking to the true Messiah, and I was filled with fear. Fear makes you run away or fight, problem solver. And I ran away from Jesus, and the men who wrote your New Testament interpreted the fear on my face for sadness. But it was fear, fear, fear. And I got some distance from Jesus, and I thought much about selling my goods. But when I got home, I looked upon my simple-minded and lame little sister, and giving up on being the one to take care of her was just unbearable. So when I got home and Sarah asked, "Brother Benjamin, is Jesus of Nazareth the true Messiah? Can he tell us how to be godly?" I said, "No, Sarah dear, he is a fraud. Go and play with your little dolls and think of him no more." And then, after the crucifixion and the resurrection and the day of Pentecost, when people would come to tell her about Jesus of Nazareth, Sarah would always say, "Brother Benjamin knew this man when he was alive, and he found him to be a fraud, and Brother Benjamin knows all. So go your way and tell me no more about Jesus." And every time that happened, problem solver, I knew I should tell Sarah that I had lied to her, but she made me feel so heroic when she looked upon me with all that need and trust in her eyes. And so my hungry sister died without believing in Jesus Christ. She hungered for righteousness, but was never filled. That was her starvation, not for bread and fish, not with ribs that you could see through the skin and a sunken belly. She died of hunger for righteousness, and she died unfilled because of the choice that I made and the lie that I told. His eyes were closed and his head was upon my shoulder, and he did not see what I saw. A young girl with a bad leg hobbling up the mountain. "If you could tell your sister the truth now, would you?" I asked. "Yes. Oh, yes." "Then lift your head, open your eyes, and get moving." He lifted his head, opened his eyes, and saw the approaching girl, and well, you've watched enough TV to know who she was. She was his hungry sister. He ran to his sister, and from a distance, I could not hear what they said to each other, but you know it was their last conversation on earth, and that they concluded it in heaven. After 2,000 years of his allowing a lie to keep them both out of the kingdom. Don't ever tell a lie, my friend. And so there I was alone on the mount with empty pockets, no knowledge of the local language, and such a light heart. Chapter 12. You're hungry, brother. I'm glad you like my story, mister, and I really appreciate the 20, but I'm handing it back with you. I don't really need your money. I just saw that you were an American. We all look alike here in Jerusalem, you know, and I get homesick to hear English spoken with an American accent. So I really, really wanted you to be the one to hear my story today. So that guy over there, the one with the chef's hat, spooning soup to poor people in the soup kitchen, both to the Jews and to the Palestinians, that's my hungry brother. And he's my best friend. And the food he is feeding all these people, you guessed it, that's the food from my 40 box cars that I got to get rid of. Jesus amended our deal after I did that. Do the right thing because it's the right thing to do thing in hell. Jesus is so easy to impress. I don't have to go live in that greedy, needy world where one bite of wormy food is worth a life and start out rich and make everybody else rich and myself poor. No, I get to get rid of my burden of guilt right here in Jerusalem, where everybody comes to walk where Jesus walked. It really is a privilege to me that you stood still all this time to listen to my story, and I fully understand that you think I'm mentally ill, and I know you are hoping you can walk away without me acting out violently, and that your plan is to tell the authorities to get me off the street. You aren't the first beautiful American I've told this story to, but please don't waste your time. The authorities will tell you that they agree that I am insane, because I really do believe all the stuff I just told you. I really believe it. But they'll also tell you that I'm harmless and nonviolent. And here in Jerusalem, the spaces in jails and mental institutions are reserved for violent people, sane or not. And they don't want me at all. So, brother from America, just shake my hand and say, God bless you, and go on up to Golgotha and stand right in the spot where they believe Jesus was crucified, and imagine that you have traveled back in time, and it's 33 AD, and you are present at the crucifixion, and imagine that the most innocent blood ever shed is dripping on you and washing away your sins. But once you've settled it in your heart that your sins are forgiven, please don't get on that 747 back to Boston or Jersey or Texas or Missouri feeling all satisfied, because the Bible you're holding in hands there tells you that you have a cross to pick up and that you have to follow Jesus. And I'm telling you that while you're following Jesus Christ up to Golgotha of your life, that you'll encounter your hungry brother. Take a break and feed that guy. That's part of the job. And let me tell you one more thing. I heard this right from the mouth of Jesus Christ himself just yesterday, because today my hungry brother and I spooned the very last of those 40 boxcars in the bowls of the poor, and we're going straight to heaven after that. And you're the only one I'll ever get to tell this next thing to, so listen up. Here it is. Do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And on Judgment Day, you'll be the one God sends out for refreshments while he has a serious talk with everyone else.